Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here on a Saturday night. I really appreciate it, and we all do, and it's an honor to be here with you. And thanks, Dan, for inviting me. Well, today is October 12th, 2024. Yesterday would have marked my father's 101st birthday, which is hard to believe. He was a high school history teacher, a hockey player, and later, for 30 years, a hockey coach. He was also an elected county legislator in New York State, 11 years as a Republican and 11 years as a Democrat. And he would have loved all this. Dad served in World War II. He didn't talk much about his service, although I knew enough to be inspired by the courage, the sacrifice, and the honor with which he and millions of others served in that war. It's really humbling to think about. And of course, during World War II, it wasn't just the soldiers stepping up. Folks back at home were growing victory gardens, learning factory work, and collecting rubber and scrap metal for the war effort. One of the stories I like best about this effort by the Americans stateside during the war comes right out of Vermont. Relative to other states, of course, we are sparsely populated now, just as we were then. But at the height of the war in 1943, the New York Times wrote about how Vermonters led the entire nation in volunteer salvage metal collection with a rate of 163 pounds per person. It was 15 years earlier, of course, that President Calvin Coolidge referred to the, quote, indomitable spirit of Vermonters when he spoke in admiration of the way people in his home state had come together after the Great Flood of 1927. You may be familiar with his words, quote, if the spirit of liberty should vanish in other parts of the Union and support of our institutions should languish, it could all be replenished from the generous store held by the people of this brave little state of Vermont. We all hope that this theory is never fully tested, of course. But we've plenty of examples of Vermonters bravely pulling together in times of trial, instilling hope with their indomitable spirit. I'm really here tonight to tell you about one remarkable example of that. In my job as director of the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, I have had a chance to work with dozens of other organizations and businesses, scores of legislators, and thousands of citizen activists on a broad range of issues, everything from protecting pollinators to strengthening our democracy. But the number one priority we have had over the last several years has been the climate crisis. By its nature, this is a worldwide threat, and the destruction caused by burning fossil fuels and heating our climate is being felt everywhere. Not long ago, many thought that Vermont might be a refuge from the ravages of climate change. Almost nobody thinks that anymore. A recent report found that Vermonters suffered through 17 federal climate disaster events between 2011 and 2021. That was the seventh most in the nation, seventh most of any state in the nation. And that's not counting 2023 and 2024. While droughts, fires, and record-breaking heat waves are making news worldwide, fossil fuel companies have been breaking records of their own with profits. In 2022, big oil raked in over $200 billion in profits. And of course, we now know that companies like Exxon, Mobil, and Shell knew decades ago that their products would disrupt the climate and cause the kind of harm that we're seeing today. So in early summer 2023, a group of about 40, mostly college-age canvassers, gathered with researchers and environmentalists to launch an audacious campaign around the simple idea that most of us learned in kindergarten. If you make a mess, you clean it up. Under this plan, the largest fossil fuel companies would be required to pay their fair share of the climate-related damages that they've caused here in Vermont over the last 30 years. I was at that launch. It was a beautiful June morning on Church Street in Burlington. Clear blue skies. Lots of shoppers and tourists would come over, and they were wondering just why it was that there was a 22-foot long inflatable pink pig in front of City Hall in Burlington. The pig, of course, was there to represent the greed of the fossil fuel industry. And this being Vermont, we did have at least one passerby who expressed concern that representing a pig in this way, comparing it to the fossil fuel industry, was grossly unfair to pigs. And that's probably a fair point. Let me just pause for a moment to say that this campaign, this was not a winnable endeavor. These companies are far too powerful. No city, no state, no country in the world had done it yet. Never. But as Margaret Mead had famously advised, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Our small group was initially made up of courageous canvassers, building support for this effort door to door, one after another. Sometimes we hear that young people are too apathetic or too tied to their phones to ever engage in important civic action. And that hasn't been my experience at all. I don't know if anybody out here, have you ever had any experience canvassing, going door to door? A few of you have. It ain't easy, right? In fact, sometimes we call it a character building experience. You're talking to people you don't know, in neighborhoods you've never been to, about issues that the folks at the door may or may not agree with you about. It's a lot of walking and biking. There are flat tires and slammed doors, scary dogs, occasional bears and skunks. More recently, we've experienced excessive heat and bad air quality days. But nobody said this would be easy. To overcome such long odds, we needed canvassers to spark a larger public outcry. And initially, most people were supportive after hearing about the basic elements of this campaign, and we had a glimmer of hope. Then everything changed on July 10th, 2023, when it started to rain. You know about the devastating flooding that followed. Homes, businesses, and farms were fouled with water, mud, and chemicals. Lives were lost and upended. I live in Montpelier, where some of our offices were flooded under 7 feet of water, and we were by no means the worst affected. When we were allowed to get back downtown, it was an eerie and kind of sad feeling. There were people in groups just taking it all in. What sticks with me most was the sound of the alarms. All around us, different buildings had their alarms going off every few seconds, each warning of danger, telling you to get out. When the immediacy of saving lives had passed and people began the task of cleanup and recovery, we heard two things pretty consistently from folks. The first was their feeling that this was going to happen again. And the second was a question: who's going to pay for all this? The campaign to demand accountability from the fossil fuel industry was no longer just the right thing to do, it was the righteous thing to do. And day after day, week after week, hundreds and then thousands of Vermonters began to get active. They signed petitions, contacted their legislators, attended community events, and wrote letters to the editor. They didn't care that this was thought to be an impossible campaign. They demanded action from one end of the state to the other. In the calls and letters and emails, they began to work. The state's powerful chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee took notice. Senator Dick Sears was an institution in the State House, kind of a gruff bear of a man. He was not known as a big environmentalist. But when toxic PFAS was found in the wells of the people in his district, he sought accountability from the industry that caused that kind of pollution. When asked who should pay, he said there were three possibilities. The victims who experienced harm, the taxpayers, or the entity that caused the problem in the first place. He became a believer in the idea that if you create a mess, you should clean it up. So when Vermonters banded together in the wake of that severe flooding, Senator Sears became an unlikely champion. He embodied that indomitable spirit of Vermonters and who were seeking at that point a measure of justice. And he did this as he himself battled cancer. In the closing days of the session in 2024, the legislature did what was thought to have been impossible. With tripartisan support, legislators made Vermont the first state in the country, the first place in the world to create a climate superfund to hold big oil accountable. And by the time Governor Scott allowed the bill to become law without his signature, Senator Sears was in the hospital. This achievement was so momentous, a radio reporter wanted to interview Senator Sears if it was possible. And the senator happily agreed to speak with the reporter, to speak with that reporter. And the next day, that story went national. And that was the day that Senator Sears passed away. May he rest in peace, knowing that when we come together, nothing is impossible. Thank you.